All right. Well, welcome everybody to session 38 of Classic Metal Class. This time we're looking at another, let's call it a scene, right? Might be the wrong word for it, depending on how we classify these things. So, we've already looked a lot at the British setting in a number of different time frames. We looked at the LA scene, which was so important, particularly in the 80s. And we've looked at some national scenes like the German metal scene, which kind of bled over into the Low Countries as well. The Japanese scene, which was its own weird kind of animal, and Nordic metal. So I thought it's about time that we filled in an important gap and we talked about Canada, because Canada kind of sneaks under the radar, I think. Scott and I were talking about this before the show. When we were young and we were listening to these bands, some of them we didn't even know they were Canadian because it wasn't publicized, right? Whereas, you hear Accept, Udo Dirkschneider, or the Scorpions, right? They're German. As soon as they do an interview and Klaus Meine can hardly talk English, you're pretty clear that he's not, English or American or Canadian or Australian or anything like that. So, as it turned out, as we're doing the research on this, we realized that Canadian bands played a pretty important role in the development and spread of heavy metal in its classic period of the 70s and 80s. And so we're going to discuss a number of bands from that era. And I think with this, we have to talk not just about straight out metal bands, but bands that are, let's call them metal adjacent. That's a term that we've used a lot in the past. We don't have a great definition for it, but you could call it a subset of hard rock that people sometimes called metal or mistook for metal, or these are bands that would tour with metal bands, and it was not one big happy family, but there was a lot of receptivity to it. Whereas I think in the present, some people might be like, oh, well, that's not metal, I'm not going to listen to it. It's not this genre of metal. And we're also going to talk about some interesting figures like Lee Aaron or John Mickle Thor, both of whom are still out there playing. And I think actually we should kind of do a little polling on this. So I think that the bands that come to mind most readily as Canadian metal bands, I picked out 4 of them, but I'd be curious to hear what others have to say. So obviously Triumph, Anvil, and I think Anvil in part because they got some more traction recently, long past the original era because of that documentary about how crappy their experience was. Helix, and then Voivod. And Voivod, I think, gets a lot of interest from people outside of metal because they shifted around through genres. But when you think about Canadian metal bands, who do you think of the most? Those guys, or are there others where you're like, yeah, I definitely remember them? So Ken mentioned Steppenwolf. Yeah, and Steppenwolf, I mean, I think we could call them proto-metal. And yeah, they were Canadian until then they became Canadian American, right? Because they got rid of some of the Canadian members and shifted in Americans. But I don't know. I think they still remain Canadian. Just like Thin Lizzy, when Scott Gorham comes on, it doesn't cease being an Irish band, right? So that's a good example. And Steppenwolf, famously Heavy Metal Thunder. So part of one of their songs, actually one of the most covered metal songs too. It seems to be irresistible to many metal bands not to do a cover of Born to Be Wild.
Oh yeah,
and they're never good.
Yeah, but that is the one that's covered the most.
Yeah,
that I've seen.
So Ken brings up Annihilator. Yeah, we're going to talk about them. Very important early thrash band, speed band. We talked about them a couple episodes back. I think in metal circles, probably they have a lot more weight than some of these other bands that are a bit more poppy. Right.
Yep.
So anyone else that comes to mind right away?
I mean, you might be able to argue early Rush.
I thought that's where you were going. Yeah.
They were, but everybody, they were kind of a Zeppelin clone band, but Zeppelin was kind of, they were rock and roll, but they were, as far as the image and everything, a big part of the metal, scene, especially as their albums went on. They got heavier. They got but I think early Rush comes to mind. We all know them but Triumph.
Yeah.
Huge.
I'm totally in agreement about Rush's first album. And then I would say it's sort of like it just kind of, it's not like the music declines. It actually becomes more technically proficient and all of that.
Yeah.
But it becomes more proggy and in some respects more poppy, at least on certain later albums.
Oh, definitely. Time Stands Still and all that stuff.
Yeah. Or Early Distant Warning.
What
was that? Grace Under Fire?
Grace Under Pressure.
Grace Under Pressure. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so another thing we're going to talk about that I think is kind of cool, which again, you don't really catch on to unless I suppose if you're up in the Canadian metal scene, unless you do the research, is there's all these distinctive aspects of Canada as a country, as a culture, that made it particularly a rich environment for heavy metal in its heyday and continuing on. And some of these things, kind of stand out as, oh yeah, of course, Canada's close to the US, so it's super easy for Canadian bands to tour with US bands. They've got access to the entire US market. But there's a whole bunch of other really interesting developments besides that. So I thought we might actually start, before we talk lots of bands and development, talk about that environment. Now, Andrew says, oh, it's a Piledriver. Yeah, we're going to talk about them and that album, Metal Inquisition. That is a very interesting album, and it's quite good, I think, so we'll come to talk about those. So there's a number of features, I would say, that Canada shared with, say, Britain and the United States. One of these was having a bar scene, or a pub and club scene in Britain, that made it possible for bands to actually do the things that they needed to do to develop. And this is something Scott and I were talking about earlier, the changes in the music industry these days. I was actually joking, but only partly, that when a band brings out a new album, they might actually make more money these days on selling the t-shirts with the album cover on it than they do selling the actual album. And that's a weird reverse. And Scott, you and I have talked about this in the past. It's harder for younger musicians to find venues to play in. And when they do, as you've talked about, nobody comes to support them. Right.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting now. Like I've seen a lot of musicians in the past few weeks talk about the state of the industry. Some are stepping away, but one in particular had said something interesting, that even the venues that exist, fewer and fewer are taking original acts. They want the tribute bands.
Oh yeah. Interesting. Because I guess that's a sure sell.
Yeah, exactly. And that's interesting. It says something about society, I think. Our society. But and especially with the bands, the big established bands, imagine if Styx did their summer tour and played the entire new album. They'd get booed. I mean, people are there for
right.
They want the hits.
Yeah.
It's a little bit off topic, but
no, I think it's entirely on topic, because the contrast here is, in the 1970s and even the 1980s, you could be a band that just doesn't really have their crap together, and you're developing as musicians, and you could go out and play in these different venues, and you're going to make a bit of money, probably not that much, but you also do two other things that's really important. One is you develop a following, because you notice, like with a lot of the bands that we're going to look at, they get formed and 5 years later they put out their first album. You know, whereas today, you know, there's all this pressure. You got to have some content, you know, not music, but content to bring to the table. And they also get to hone their skills. I mean, this is something that I think a lot of the British bands and American bands talked about, you know, playing in different venues. They got to be good musicians in part by screwing up and then readjusting, right?
Well, an important point on that too is it was allowed to happen. You know, if say you were just developing your stuff, you can experiment live, and once you left, everybody left, it was gone forever. Now, if you go out, you know, especially with, I guess, comedians, people have their phones out and that'll be up on. So people are less likely to, these days, they're less likely to experiment. So content, that's a very good distinction you said, because
content versus music.
Yeah, because they're different things.
Yeah.
They're people will say they're the same thing, but if you really break it down, it's different things.
Now, here's something interesting that Ken is saying. In the early days, enthusiasm was much more important than technical professionalism for the fans when it came to live concerts. And this is from somebody who was seeing, you know, big bands and eventually becoming big bands in Britain in the heyday of heavy metal. And I think that holds pretty consistently from scene to scene to scene, you know. I think of concerts I went to in the 80s, and if they screwed up, I wasn't going to be like, oh, I want my ticket money back or some crazy crap like that, you know.
Well, Ken, that's such a good, I always point to this. That's a great statement. My friend and I don't know if I've brought this up before, but the first guitarist for Duran Duran was Andy Taylor.
Yeah.
And Andy Taylor put out this rock album when he went solo, and killer album, great songs. And on MTV, it must have been 86 New Year's Eve, he went up and they were kind of drunk, and the songs were so great, and there was a little out of tuneness. There was sometimes, there was definitely drunken mistakes, but the fire was there and the songs were there. And my friend and I go, why do we listen to this? Because it's so good, and it's what Ken's saying. The enthusiasm was the moment, and it was just kind of like, oh, it's not about the mistakes, it's about the whole experience of the vibe of it. They were going for it, and they were, the songs were so great, and it was in the moment. It's not the criteria of today.
Yeah, and if you're at a club or a pub or whatever, the local Lions Club sometimes is where some of these bands would play in America, right?
Right.
You'd have a couple beers, and maybe you snuck them because you were underage, and you'd be headbanging, and so you're not watching it as like a technical performance. You're like, yeah, he messed up that chord right there.
Well, and online, that's what people do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the sentiment of what was before, the stuff that we're talking about, the bands that we're talking about, had this chance to develop. Now people spend 15 hours on one phrase and then piece it together so it's perfect in like multiple takes. And I think it's important to point out where with these bands that we're talking about that developed, if they existed now, we would never have heard from them.
Yeah, that's
right.
They
wouldn't have had, because the experience is different, like Ken says.
Yeah. So another really important factor that we talked about a little bit is if you're from Canada, because Canada is so close to the US. I mean, there's vast parts of Canada that aren't, but hardly anybody lives there, and probably not people who are going to be touring with a band. It's very easy, or at least it was very easy back then, for Canadians to tour in the United States or to go over to, Britain and tour there. And there was a lot of back and forth opening or being the headliner for American and British bands, or for Australian bands that made it over to the US, like AC/DC, So I think that also contributed to it. Once you'd made it, you could go on tour and continue to make good money. There were some other things that were distinctively Canadian, though. So one thing that I think is really interesting, the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission has still, but they had these requirements, which were from this Broadcasting Act of Canada, that required there to be a certain proportion of Canadian artists played on the radio, on other things like TV, and they assigned it on the basis of what they called MAPL, so music, artist, performance, and lyrics. That's how you could define what counted as Canadian content. And this happened in 1971. So this is at the beginning of the period that we're talking about. And I think you could think of it as like giving a boost to all these Canadian bands. From the research that I did, it sounds like part of why they enacted this is there was a viewpoint that like Canadian bands just weren't as good as American bands or British bands. And so it was almost like protectionism, they need some training wheels or a boost in the arm or something. But it's great because it meant that Canadian bands were, once they got onto the radio, they were going to get played, they were going to get heard. So it wasn't just whatever sells, man, and
Right.
I'm kind of curious to see what you make of this, Scott, as an American musician, because it's not as if you're shut out of the Canadian market or anything.
Right.
But what do you make of this sort of protectionist stuff?
I think it's pretty brilliant. I mean, I think it's, I mean, if you really kind of scope out, it's good for the economy.
Okay.
You've got like, for once, maybe the government has a musician's back. You're right, because really, you said it. If Canadian bands are being played on the radio, that's where people discover it, especially at that time. People would listen to the radio and you hear this great song you would never hear otherwise.
Right. Yeah.
And another thing you said that was perfect, was right on, was, you play what you're paid to play, or you play what's, the payola, or you play. I mean, things like that can't get in the way of playing a not so known artist. So you can get. I mean, the bottom line is, I think it was a great. It is a great idea. I didn't know they were still doing it. Actually,
I guess you could say too that it's going to have a cumulative effect, right? So there are bands and musicians who otherwise might have dropped out because they're not getting enough airplay. They stay in, they get better, they provide models for younger bands or opportunities to tour with them. And so it's got a kind of I forget what the name of that is, but it's sort of like when you put $1 into a local business, they talk about the circulation of money. So it's kind of a good investment to do.
Yeah, absolutely. For all the stuff that you said, you give younger people that may live in Canada that may play an instrument. Oh, there's no Canadian bands. Well, who am I kidding? But you hear Canadian bands on the radio, and these are people from your, where you live. I think it's all good. I don't know of any other thing like that. Do you? Was there any other law like that in another country?
I don't know. I suspect that there's probably some stuff like this in some of the Nordic countries, but I don't actually know. I mean, you could also appeal to like nationalism. We need to support our local artists.
Sure.
And I think in some countries there's at least some that sort of national pride. They're not into like waving flags and stuff, but
right. I think it's a great idea. It was a great idea. And look, in the end, maybe we wouldn't have heard from some of these bands that we love so much.
Yeah.
If they didn't have the chance, if there's a buzz about them up there, chances are people from America are going to hear about them.
That's right. Yeah. It allows it to travel overseas. So a couple other things that I think also mutually supported it, the Canadians began giving out Juno awards. in 1970, and they also tied it in later on with the Canadian Music Hall of Fame. BTO, who we're going to talk about shortly, they won some of those. There were a lot of bands who were nominees, and it's sort of like the Grammys. If you get a nomination, that's pretty good, right? You can I'm a Grammy nominee, didn't win, but, and so, it included Rush. They had like year after year after year where they were in it. Triumph, April Wine, Helix, Honeymoon Suite, the Killer Dwarfs. There's also, starting in 2012, a heavy metal album of the year Juno award, and it was awarded several times to Voivod. Kind of unsurprising because they're very technically proficient and all of that. And then, Anvil and Annihilator were nominees for that. So it shows, again, a level of support.
Yeah.
We talked about a Canadian heavy metal magazine last session called Metallion that was started in 1984. So really at the heyday of 80s metal.
Yeah.
And they would talk about bands from all over the place, but they also were very good about promoting Canadian bands. So the very first their first issue includes Anvil and Helix. Had a Lee Aaron centerfold. The second included Exciter. The third included Triumph. And, they're just continually including Canadian stuff. They had their own rival to MTV and VH1 called MuchMusic that actually went the same kind of route, originally focusing on music programming. And then eventually they realized there's more money to be made in other stuff. But the thing that I thought was the most interesting and funniest, quirkiest thing is the role that hockey played in promoting heavy metal, because hockey is such a huge sport up in Canada, understandably so, given that, you've got baseball, you do have basketball to some extent, they got their own football thing, but hockey, I would say, rules. And so I'm going to read this interesting quote, and it shows that it's not just like going to hockey games, but it's also other things. So this is from a discussion of heavy metal, Canadian identity and heavy metal. In Canada, our school system introduces children to metal at a very young age. Most of us had our first exposure to it at those mandatory school winter skating lessons in local community hockey arenas with metal ballads blaring as we tumbled around, bruising knees and bleeding on the ice. It's no fluke that Canadian metal band Anvil is the one who recorded the classic track Blood on the Ice. What is it about hockey arenas and heavy metal music anyway? Well, if you haven't fallen flat on the ice with Helix blaring Rock You as other kids zip past laughing, you haven't had a proper Canadian childhood. And, you think to like today where, you watch NFL football and they are playing AC/DC or Metallica or Ozzy Osbourne, and you're like, man, that would never have happened when we were kids, because at that time we were considered like the degenerates and the druggies and burnouts, and sports people were like, that's not good at all,
Right.
But now it's just all become part of the same commercial complex. I think you can say that in Canada, heavy metal had an easier sell in part because of hockey culture, and the prevalence of skating. Like we would go roller skating when I was in the 70s and 80s, but you weren't going to hear heavy metal stuff. You were going to hear R&B and pop and things like that. And maybe every once in a while you might hear something that's kind of on the poppy end, like Poison or, Van Halen's Jump or something like that, right? But you weren't going to hear, maybe there are roller skating places where they play actual like heavy metal, but we didn't have any of those where I grew up. Did you grow up with that, Scott?
I did, and there's a great story that ties in with this. There was a DJ that was playing actual records.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and you hear everything from Madonna, but I'll never forget, and I think this was the DJ's choice. right when Rush's Moving Pictures came out, he
Okay.
played Tom Sawyer.
Oh,
And I was obsessed to the point where I stopped skating and I waited by the DJ booth, and I had to wait till the song was over, and I was waving to the guy, right? And I said, "What was that?" And he handed me the album cover, and I just wanted to go home, and like I hounded my mom to buy it. So I really discovered Rush at the roller skating rink.
That's cool.
I thought that was like the coolest song I had heard. It was the first time I heard it, and but yeah, it's interesting you say that with the hockey. Before the session, I didn't know. I wouldn't have occurred to me that hockey played a role or skating. Let's just say skating, ice skating.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's upbeat, aggressive music. Hockey's a pretty aggressive game.
Yes.
You want to see fights and stuff like that. Interestingly, a little bit of trivia, and this is just based on my experience. So, the NHL used to fight a lot, not so much anymore. The lower you go in the professional levels, the more these guys like to fight. So like when we go see the Admirals here in Milwaukee, I don't think we've ever gone to a game where there hasn't been a fight out on the ice. And some of them have been actually pretty brutal. But you go to the level below that. I remember in North Carolina, I would go see, I don't know what they're called anymore, but they were the Fire Ants at the time. And it was about as low as you could go in the professional level. And you wouldn't watch like 5 to 7 minutes without somebody getting in a fight and then being in the penalty box. And I was like, whoa, these guys are hardcore, So, I mean, you could think of metal and aggressivity kind of fitting in with that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. So let's talk bands. So Ken already mentioned Steppenwolf. I think they're a great example of proto metal, definitely influenced a lot of metal bands. They're Canadian. Oh, Andrew has a good question here. Going back, I'm guessing, to the hockey thing. Do you think that's because these bands have been mainstreamed? Like someone would wear an AC/DC shirt without listening to them. Sports seems to play off that kind of primal energy that's acceptable now. Like WWF uses metal music in its advertising, has for a long time. And Lemmy composed a song just for the WWF, King of Kings, I think it was.
Oh.
So he says, in fairness, ice hockey and metal's a great combination in the UK. It's rare, especially in my team's stadium, to hear metal music. We aren't mainstream though. Yeah. So, I mean, what we're seeing with this, I think there is definitely a phenomenon that's been going on for a long time with certain bands. So Metallica, Iron Maiden, AC/DC, who else fits into that, where people wear the shirts, but they're like, this is just a fashion choice. I don't listen to the music at all.
I mean, there's the Clash.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I suppose a lot of punk bands too.
Yeah.
Right?
There's punk bands definitely fit that.
If somebody's wearing like a Raven t-shirt or a Venom t-shirt or a Girl School t-shirt, they're probably somebody who likes the band. Right.
Right.
But if somebody's wearing an Iron Maiden t-shirt these days, you can't really tell. Oh, Andy brings up Def Leppard. Yeah.
That's
and
a good
Nirvana.
one.
Yeah. I think that's quite true. But I think what we're talking about with this antedates that, so it's not the like 2000s on kids trendy wear stuff, which I don't know. I mean, maybe that got a boost from Guitar Hero too, kids playing that and being like, I like Def Leppard. I do the little buttons on my fake guitar to, rock me or something like that.
I wonder, I mean, I know I've been in instances where I've been at like funk jazz type jams. And I remember one young bass player was wearing an Iron Maiden shirt.
Okay.
And she was playing at the time I was playing. It was kind of this place in Boston where a lot of the heavy musicians go to hang out. And I said, "Oh, I made the mistake of saying you're a Maiden fan." And she looked at me puzzled. She wasn't aware of what she was wearing. and then it finally dawned on me that she was
Oh.
kind of wearing it, and stupid me is like all excited to say, "What's your favorite album?"
Yeah. I mean, the irony, of course, with that is that Steve Harris is such a great technical bassist that he
Right.
gets love from jazz musicians. Stanley Clark had this bass book, and I don't remember what it was called exactly, but I had it. And I remember like reading, a lot of it was just technical stuff, but like part of it was like, you need to, study these people and these people. And there were only two arguably metal musicians who he suggested one ought to study. One was Geddy Lee and the other one was Steve Harris.
Oh, that's
And he
so cool.
praised both of them. And he's like, here's what you need to get from each of these guys,
Wow.
So Ken says Guitar Hero was important. I think a load of kids who played and enjoyed the music went on to become actual fans. Yeah, it could be. I was so far out of that.
I was too.
Things. I didn't really play. What do we call those console games? Like PlayStation and all of that. I never got into that, so I missed that whole scene.
Yeah. I remember when it was going on, but I actually never played.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder too. So like we could do an episode on this sometime. Like what are things outside of actual going to performances that promote interest in bands? So the game Guitar Hero would be one of those things. I mean, YouTube stuff would be another, watching reaction videos where somebody's like, holy shit, this is what Ronnie James Dio sounds like. It's amazing.
Yeah, right.
But I think that karaoke probably plays a role as well,
Yeah.
But you can find certain metal songs in karaoke lists. When I have to do karaoke, I go look for them. But there's not a lot, I think,
No,
so.
I don't think so.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably like specialized metal karaoke places around the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to bands. So we mentioned Steppenwolf, and we've already talked about Rush a little bit. They get founded in 68. And I would say it's not really Rush until Neil Peart comes on in 74 because he's so integral to the band. And that's when they put out that first album, which certainly from 70s standards is heavy metal. I mean, it's got the heavy sound, it's kind of plodding. It's also got some fast parts, Working Man. I think, all of us have heard that a million times. I would say, Fly By Night, Caress of Steel still have some metal-y stuff on them, right? Interestingly, Primus plays in some of their tours the entirety of A Farewell to Kings.
Yeah,
because they were originally like Rush inspired, so
and they were friends. I know. I know the bands are friends.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did hear that.
Yeah. So we'll come to Andy's comments in a moment because we're getting some movement with bands. So one of the bands that I ran across that actually is kind of interesting, and then we're going to do an episode on doom metal later on, is Warpig. They were founded in 68, sort of like putting together other bands into theirs. They released the self-titled album in 72. They broke up, down the line, so they didn't release other stuff. But what they've got is pretty heavy and pretty interesting. Then there was April Wine. We were talking about them earlier. I didn't know that they were Canadian until later on. They were just kind of pitched as, you like metal stuff, you like these guys. And I thought they were a little on the softer side by the 80s, comparing them to like, Judas Priest, Defenders of the Faith. Okay. Yeah. But they were good and they were pretty massive. They got a lot of traction. They were out with albums in 71 and 72 and then more throughout the 70s and 80s. They toured around the U.S. a lot, opening for bands like the Rolling Stones and Styx and Rush. So that's kind of, an interesting one. There was another band that I didn't know about called Mahogany Rush, and I've been listening to some of their stuff. So the comparison is always made to Hendrix with the guitarist, and I kind of think that some of their stuff reminds me of what Uli John Roth was doing. Another person very influenced by Hendrix, but with the Scorpions behind him.
Right.
They had a lot of albums. They're in that scene as well. Then we get to BTO, Bachman-Turner Overdrive, formed by brothers Randy, Robbie, and Tim Bachman and Fred Turner. Their debut album, interestingly, breaks through in a border area like Detroit and Buffalo, and they stay on the charts for a number of weeks without even having a hit single. Although, if we had to think of a hit single, what's the one BTO song that everybody knows? Taking Care of Business, which is a great song. But they were considered to be, if not heavy metal, at least metal adjacent.
Yeah.
Right. And then we have this band called Moxy that forms in 73, and they have a self-titled debut album. I would say that some of their stuff is just hard rock, but I think there's some metal songs on it, like Can't You See I'm a Star and Moonrider. And interestingly, in 1976, they tour with Black Sabbath. So clearly somebody thought they kind of belonged together, It's not like Black Sabbath and Styx or something like that.
Right.
And they had, by 77, AC/DC is opening for them. So that shows you a kind of a rise there. And, I think they're certainly worth listening to. So before we talk about the bands that that did identify as metal, let's look at Andy's comment. I wonder how much, this is going back to like the cultural stuff, I wonder how much of it connects with younger humans raiding the closets of their parents. There was a kid in my MyEd class who always had the most obscure, cool shirts, revolting cocks, pig face, and said he found an old box in the attic of his dad's stuff. He did end up getting into the music, but just out of curiosity. It's fascinating how much of those of us in Gen X hold very strong reactions to what wearing a band shirt might mean. For some of us, it was the uniform. Yeah. So I think there's something to that. And maybe we feel a sense of selling out or betrayal, or when somebody's just wearing a Nirvana shirt, but they don't know any of the songs, I mean, we don't want to turn into those gatekeepers who are like, name 5 songs by that band.
I always had mixed feelings about that, because although that's a legitimate question, because, it's like you're a real fan of the band and then somebody's wearing it ironically, that could anger people. So it's like, you don't have a right to wear that. I'm the real fan. I went to see him in 81.
I mean, it is, yeah. It's we should probably do a whole show on that topic as like an ethical issue, because on the one hand, if you want a healthy scene, it's got to be intergenerational, right?
Yes.
And it's not enough just to stick with the kids that we see when we go to concerts, where like they're there with their parents and they're rocking out to it, which holds not just for metal. Like actually when Andy and I went and saw Peter Hook and the Light, there was like a whole family with like young kids there who were there with their mom and dad watching Peter Hook do all the Joy Division and New Order songs, If we gatekeep too hard, we're going to become a smaller and smaller community. That's not good, right?
Right.
On the other hand, if we say anything goes, then there's nobody respects that. Right?
Right. Yeah, so, yeah. But that was the thing for a while. It's like, you'd see, it's like, do you know who that band is? Huh? Oh no, I'm just wearing this.
So Ken says I've had to buy some CDs to stop my original vinyl from being worn out by the latest generation of metal fans. Yeah. And then Andy says, I was surprised to learn of the significant role Canadian bands had on American hardcore. So that's something I don't know about. bands like DOA and Propaganda and the Vile Tones. That's interesting. Yeah. I wonder, I don't think that we can say that Canadian bands had a massive influence as Canadian bands on British or American or other area heavy metal bands, other than Rush is very influential.
Oh, yeah.
Could we say that Triumph was? I mean, they're a big band, but I don't know that people were like, yeah, my influences include Triumph.
That's a good point. Triumph was a huge band, but Rush was clearly influential in their different eras as far as how they played, how they wrote stuff, how they put stuff together. Yeah, and I never, as great as Rick Emmett is, I've never heard a lot of people say Rick Emmett was an influence.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could say Anvil was influential, but in an underground way, right?
Right.
Their stuff was circulating around in those tape swapping networks that we participated in, but we didn't know they were Canadian.
I know.
Well,
that's true.
Yeah. So Andrew and Ken have raised an interesting thing too. Listening to Canadian bands recently, I think bands like Anvils with Metal on Metal, Piledriver, Metal Inquisition, Exciter, Long Live the Loud, make metal both the genre and the message. Does metal about metal suggest insecurity, self-affirmation, or cultural isolation? And Ken says, I'd argue for the most part it's self-affirmation, but interested to hear everyone's opinions. I mean, I don't think that it has to do with insecurity. Except maybe, and this is probably going to steer us in a whole different direction, maybe with the exception of bands where they're trying to cash in and they don't really have the metal chops. We all remember in the mid 80s, by the time that heavy metal had become cool again and culturally relevant, there were all these like lower tier bands that would have anthems about metal, and they weren't any good, and oftentimes they're pretty soft. A lot of people try to get in on heavy metal, so I think we talked about this a bit in a session about metal identity and metal songs about metal. I think that it's about self-affirmation, and I also think it's about like having fun. You make a song, and you talk about, nowadays you can make a song and talk about, as Raven did on their second to last album, I think, Extermination. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's their third last album. They have a song where they like go through like the lore basically of all these different heavy metal bands. It's almost like a chronicle, I don't know. What do you think, Scott, with metal musicians making songs about heavy metal?
Well, we did talk about that in an earlier, singing about heavy metal. I think we also did discuss, because during the heyday, the big theme, the anthem was about rebellion.
Yeah,
that's
true.
So jumping in on, I mean, I can't name anything off the top of my head, but I remember hearing really cheesy rebellion lyrics that just were, it's like, wait a minute, this isn't, I'm not convinced. I'm not on board with this,
We're going to heavy metal you until you can't raise your head or something like that.
Yeah. I do, looking back, now that you mentioned, this is the era where metal was a big thing, people trying to get in on it. But some people weren't just cut out for it. You can't fool a metalhead. It's hard to fool a metalhead.
Yeah. So let's talk about some bands, many of which started in the 70s, and they did identify, at least at some point, as heavy metal. Some of these are in kind of interesting ways. So one that is very hard to find is called Hellhound. And unfortunately, only a few of their songs got recorded, but the ones that are there are pretty good. You can find them on YouTube. They were a blues-based metal band that was influenced by Deep Purple and Cream and Jimi Hendrix. They have, apparently had legendary performances, but we don't nobody bothered to bootleg those. So we've only got a few things out there. And then I mentioned we were going to talk about this guy, John Mickle Thor, who's still playing, by the way. So they start out pretty early in 1973 as this concept band. And early on, they're called Centaur and Mickle Body Rock. Now, why? The concept is John Mickle Thor is a big, tough guy. So he would do stuff like bend steel bars, and he would, to show his lung strength, he would take hot water bottles and blow them up until they exploded, stuff like that. And so he was like a big bodybuilder type, and you can see it on his albums. So they released a album, Muscle Rock, as Thor and the Imps in early on. And then there's this 1977 album, Keep the Dogs Away. And they're not really metal at that time, but they start getting heavier and heavier. And John Mickle Thor is going to move to New York City. And then eventually they relocate to Britain, and they get into the heavy metal scene. I think if heavy metal had not been like a really big popular thing, maybe Thor wouldn't have done that. And they put out a couple good albums, Only the Strong, Wild in the Streets. Those are decent. I would say they're not great metal, but they're fun, So, Raising Hell makes it onto Metal Killer's collection. There's a song called Anger, which is just wonderful as a song. It has one of the cheesiest videos ever produced out there.
And that's saying something.
Yeah, I mean, look it up. It's incredible to see. I mean, a lot of the videos that were concept videos at the time in the 80s were not great, looking back on it, but this one is really awful. But they were a fun band. Kick Axe, real Canadian favorite. They go through a number of frontmen until in 1983 they get somebody from our, when I say our, I don't mean me and Scott, I mean me and Andy, our native city, Milwaukee. They get this guy George Christen on vocals, and I remember hearing them in the 80s. Them being recommended and the tape circulating around. They had 3 albums coming out in the mid 80s: Vices, Welcome to the Club, and Rock the World. So, kind of an important feature. And then we get Triumph, and Triumph, I would say, because if we exclude Rush, I would say Triumph is the most successful Canadian heavy metal band. And again, something that we'll maybe talk about in another show. Scott and I have been kicking this idea around. You think about Triumph's music, and it's this very it is heavy metal, but it's this very upbeat kind of stuff. But it's not like Pollyannish like Christian metal often is,
Right.
It's not white metal, right? The opposite to black metal. They just kind of did it. And, songs like Magic Power or Fight the Good Fight. I mean, that could be a wonderful anthem for like how to get yourself through a crappy existence and not lose hope. So they became big. I mean, they were part of the US Festival in 1983. They were headliners at the Canada Jam Festival. And interestingly, I was listening back into their early catalog. Their very first album, they've got a song, What's Another Day of Rock and Roll. The lyrics start out, we've been 5 years working in a rock and roll band, blasting heavy metal right across the land. This is 1966. So they've already got, now it's heavy metal conceived of in the 70s, but this is already integral to their identity, So they put out a number of great albums throughout the 70s and 80s. And actually, I want to get your reaction to this, Scott. So Rick Emmett, he's done lots and lots of interviews, and he's asked about Triumph and Rush. And he said, I've always said it, and I'll say it again now. They had nice coattails. And there were nice things. Triumph was able to get a record second look by radio people because of the fact that Rush had been there before, concert promoters, all that kind of stuff. So they made our life easier in some respects, you know. And in other places, you ask, like, you know, Triumph and Rush, you know, so sort of like people used to do with like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, who's the best, you know? And he's like, I mean, Rush is better, but you know, we're not slouches, you know.
Right. I like it. I like that. That's a consistent answer too. But that's kind of interesting. I mean, Triumph had very strong songs.
Yeah,
they're a great band, and you know, I don't know. I mean, I guess we'll never know the answer. But if there was no Rush, I feel like there. I mean, is he saying there might not be a Triumph?
I think he's saying it would have been harder to succeed. You know,
yeah,
maybe it wouldn't have been. Some of these bands, right? They form in the mid 70s. They don't manage to bring out an album until 83, 84, when now heavy metal is cool and big, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, I'm trying to think. I feel like Triumph's heyday was like the early 80s. That's when they were like their biggest. And so it took a few albums. And then, of course, their back catalog went crazy.
Yeah, I mean, if you had to pick one album, I think Allied Forces, which is 1981, would probably be the one that circulated around the most.
That was the breakout one. That was where they started. I think they started headlining, and the early 80s is when I heard about them.
Yeah, me too.
You know? And I think, you know, speaking about set lists, that they played older stuff in their set list, I think the fans went back and bought the albums that maybe didn't succeed at the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and then was that live album they did? Was that 85 or was that earlier? I'm forgetting the name of the album. It's the front cover of the stage. Somebody here knows.
Yeah.
But I think that was the first Triumph album I had, because it was kind of like a greatest hits.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of live albums are like that. You know, down the line, we're going to have to do something about live albums, I think, specifically. And I think that's an important feature of them. They introduce you, if the band has a long catalog, they introduce you to a lot of stuff that you might not hear if you've only got the latest album.
Right.
You know, but you might also be hearing it with like a faster, heavier composition to it, you know?
Yeah. You mean performance?
Yeah.
That's happened. I mean, not metal, but like Cheap Trick's I Want You to Want Me. The real version's the live version. If you go back to the album version, it's half the tempo. It's not at all like the live one. So like, you know, you can have some disappointed fans if you go to the wrong version.
Yeah, that's funny, because you can think about like metal. We did the whole thing on metal covers, right? And sometimes the covers are way better than the original, you know. But sometimes they're, you know, like I would say Diamond Head's Am I Evil is better than Metallica's Am I Evil, even though Metallica's is heavier.
Right.
But you know, like if you had to take like well, Green Manalishi is a prime example. I don't know if any of you have listened to the Fleetwood Mac version of it, but it's terrible, you know. But what Judas Priest did with it is really great, you know. So with the live thing, it's almost like you're covering your own song, and now you're doing it in a heavier way, you know, because it's 1983 and you wrote the song in 77, you know.
Right. Your sound has changed.
Yeah. I mean, on that point, a total digression, because it's not even about Canadian bands. So House of Pain, which was on Van Halen's 1984, is a song that apparently they had been playing as an original way back in the 70s. It was part of their club repertoire. And it would be interesting to hear what it sounded like back then. It probably wasn't as heavy, because it's probably one of the heaviest songs on 1984, along with Girl Gone Bad. There's one other standout heavy song, but I'm blanking on it right offhand. I mean, heavier than like, Panama and Jump
Right.
and All Weight and Hot for Teacher and stuff like that. But it'd be interesting to hear what the original was like. Was it as fast? Was it as heavy?
And you have to remember that, and that's before a producer got hold of it.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it was Ted Templeton. Was it still him?
That sounds right.
Yeah, because I know he did the early records.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about a few other, and I'm going to run through these pretty quick because we do have a kind of time limit today. So some of the other bands that I think are kind of worth checking out: White Wolf, Rapid Tears, Fist is another one, and then there's Exciter, and we've talked about them before when we were talking about speed metal. They're naming themselves after a Judas Priest song. They put out Heavy Metal Maniac in '83, Violence and Force in '84, Long Live the Loud in '85, Unveiling the Wicked. So just album after album after album. They're really quite worth checking out. And then we've got Anvil. Anvil forms in '78. And by '81, their albums they have to put out independently, so they're not getting the kind of traction that they need, and they got screwed around by their first record company in ways that made it onto the documentary, But then they recovered and brought out more albums in the late '80s with Metal Blade record, have continually toured, massive influence on thrash metal and other speed metal. So, pretty important band, I would say, as well. And then, in the '80s, as we were mentioning, you could market stuff as heavy metal, whereas before you were kind of swimming upstream. So we should talk about Lee Aaron, and I would be interested to hear. Scott and I were talking about this before the show. She really wasn't on our radar very much.
No.
And I'd be curious to hear if other people had encountered her stuff. I would like to say, without putting her down, that she's sort of like a Canadian Lita Ford. She saw a way to go. She liked heavy music, but her stuff that she's got isn't really that heavy. Although she put together kind of an all-star band. Rick Emmett was one of the people who played with her. But I think she, there's the heavy metal queen thing that she kind of got sick of hearing. Yeah. She was viewed as like sort of a sexy heavy metal lady. I think that kind of tracks with Lita Ford as well. And I was joking before. I was saying, well, she was no Doro, right? She's no Doro Pesh. So I didn't hear about her until much later. Scott, you said you had inklings of her. Or?
Inklings, like, well, when I saw the name, it was one of those, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. And then when I looked her up, I wasn't really familiar. I mean, like I had said, there was that one tune that Blue Oyster Cult had recorded as well.
Yeah.
That I actually think her version was better.
Okay.
But I mean, I saw a live version of it. But she had a good band with her. She was charismatic and she could sing. But I don't know. Was she? I mean, and I looked. She's still doing big festivals.
Yeah. Like
the metal festival. So I mean, I guess I'm surprised that she, I didn't know more about her. It's like, how did this? I wondered, is anybody here? Were they aware of her, or because I had heard the name over the years, and then it came down to actually I don't know any of her music.
Yeah, I think she did. I kind of get the impression that she didn't get that much traction here in the U.S. by comparison to Canada. I think she was huge in Canada,
Okay. That could make sense then.
And you mentioned like the metal festivals. Well, if you manage to survive long enough, there's money to be made and going back over your old stuff. She is still making new music, which is not, and to her credit, she hasn't just coasted on being metal queen,
Right.
I mean, that album has her like in furs with a sword and stuff like that. So it was very, very much tied in with the swords and sorcery kind of look,
Right.
On that note, again, total digression. One of the biggest disappointments for me was getting, I forget which Molly Hatchet album it was, but he's sitting, there's a warrior with a gigantic axe sitting on like a war horse, they're all in armor and stuff like that. And I was like, oh man, I've heard of these guys. This is going to be awesome. And then I got it and it was like, it's basically just Southern rock, people had said it was heavy metal, but that's because they deliberately marketed to heavy metal in like the early 80s because heavy metal was becoming big,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't bring that up to say that Lee Aaron was doing that, but I do think that it wasn't solidly metal, maybe,
Yeah, the band, like I would say the band checked the boxes as far as the guitar tone,
yeah,
and the riffs. I mean, she would function fantastic in a rock band.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. So I think I know what you mean. It's kind of, she was able to cross over by getting the right band with her, and to be called heavy metal. And then of course we had that whole thing about the topic of what makes heavy metal lyrics.
right. Yeah.
And I think she did that too. I mean, obviously.
Yeah.
But she's a great singer, great. But yeah, I think, and I haven't heard her new stuff. I'd be curious to see what if she's gone to like more of a rock and roll thing, or.
So Ken says, I always thought Lee Aaron was and is underrated, very talented musically. She even has a jazz album. So,
see, I didn't know that.
Some real range there,
I'm gonna have to check that out. That's interesting.
Yeah. So, some other bands that I think are well worth checking out. One is really just metal adjacent, Coney Hatch. But interestingly, they got to tour around with Iron Maiden and Rough Cut and Accept. So clearly somebody thought they were heavy enough in the early 80s to be doing that. And then we get Sword. And I really like the stuff that we have from them. They've got this album Metalized in 86. The album cover's kind of weird, but the music's good. Very aggressive, very melodic. Killer Dwarfs, I think quite a few of us have probably heard of them. They got some good MTV play. Kind of a new wave of British heavy metal sound. They like to joke around a lot. They put out albums starting in the early 80s and then throughout the 80s. There was another band that I guess you could again call metal adjacent. People were calling it heavy metal at the time, but when you listen to it, maybe not so much, called Honeymoon Suite. Formed in Niagara Falls. What's that?
I'm a huge Honeymoon Suite fan.
Are you? Okay.
Oh, especially that Big Prize album. I think.
So what do you think? Are they metal or not?
Yeah, I mean, they got the riffs. I mean, by the time they did Love Changes Everything, it was a little more poppy. Was that 86?
Yeah.
But the vocal was kind of metal-esque. The riffs are metal-esque. But yeah. I mean, it was a little. I definitely wouldn't call it just straight rock and roll.
Okay, so it's got a metal flavor to it.
Yeah, I would say metal adjacent is fair.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I just think they wrote such great tunes. Yeah, I mean, they to me were a little more like not just like, but in the ballpark of early Bon Jovi.
Okay.
Like that kind of songwriting where it's got heavy guitars and stuff and some riff.
I was thinking like if we're gonna call like Slaughter metal or Great White metal, that maybe Honeymoon Suite can sneak into.
Well, that's well put. Great White was clearly post Zeppelin bluesy rock.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, but there's always that mystery that we have that we always go back to, like, well, I saw it next to the Aussie patch on the back of some guy's jacket. You know?
Yeah.
You know, it's if it makes the jacket, it's at least metal adjacent.
Yeah, or we have that other criterion. If it's something that you would hear in the back of, you know, some older dirtbag's car as you're driving
Yes.
around, like, because it's in a tape cassette thing, along with the Iron Maiden and Accept and Scorpions and stuff like that, right?
That's a great one. That's my favorite.
Yeah, we should probably write that down sometime, because
that's a great one.
It's such an experiential thing. I mean, and then you'd like smell the tobacco and faint odor of pot. There'd probably be like some, you know, the back seat would have some parts of it, you know, kind of picked out where you can see not the styrofoam, but the foam of the seat by it. There'd be some cigarette burns. You know?
Exactly. No, I mean, I've got this picture to be like, exactly. You know, you're crossing the street and he drives by slowly, like from a red light, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, that's got to be metal.
Yeah. But then there's like the whole genre of like the friend's older brother or sister who's like 4 years older than them, who's like, here, listen to this, kid, you know. And of course they smell like pot too, because
always, always. I was, you know, it's funny, you know, because we've talked about that. When I was at friends' houses, I would, you know, often the older brother or sister would be up listening to something.
Yeah.
And I was always curious what
on their stereo, right?
Yeah. And I was always kind of curious. I was always kind of listening, going, "Oh, that's cool. I wonder what that is." You know,
yeah.
Should I go up? I can't go up. I'm, you know, they're so much older than me, like 3 years older than me.
Yeah, and cooler, you know,
and cooler. Yeah,
with some kid like me. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my
yeah,
God.
those age differences at that age were like vast gulfs, you know.
Big time.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one other. Are they metal? Are they not? And then we'll jump into some like these are definitely metal bands. So there's another band called Urgent that you know, they've got these really keyboard heavy things, but I think the guitars on it are pretty strong. They had an album called Timing, which was reissued later on. I gave it a listen. I'm willing to say they're metal, but they're not like super heavy metal.
They're not like Judas Priest heavy metal.
Exactly. Yeah. And certainly not the Judas Priest of the time when we could compare them, you know.
Right.
So, Andrew actually has a question here before we jump into like talking about like Razor and Witchkiller. This is for you. Are there compositional or structural signatures, short riff cycles, abrupt key changes, lack of bridges that set Canadian metal apart from US or UK bands? And then what limitations or advantages do you think Canadian guitarists had in the 1980s in terms of accessing gear and formal or informal instruction? Would that have like made things different for them from American or British counterparts?
That's a really good question. You know, as far as I think what a lot of guitarists did, even the American ones, is back then their YouTube was the albums. You'd buy the Van Halen record you buy, and you do your best to copy. I mean, all of us had to wait. We talked about this. We had to wait for the magazine to come out once a month that had the tablatures to maybe 5 songs. You know, the gear, you know, off the top of my head, I don't know, and not to say there isn't, I just off the top of my head, I don't know any Canadian gear companies, but I'm sure the big ones like Fender or Marshall, I mean, you could get access to those there. Definitely. And, you know, I think they had American stuff was being played on the radio there. Yeah. They had access to the albums. As far as the song structure, I don't think there was a difference. I think there was, I mean, the bands, like if we went to Rush, their structures became entirely different. As far as it was more prog-like, I mean.
Yeah.
No, I mean, if I think of either Honeymoon Suite or Triumph, the songs, the basic song structures were the same. And I mean, there was nothing that cued me off that they were like not from America when I heard them. Like I said, there's some of these bands I thought were from America that I didn't realize till later.
Yeah.
The sounds are pretty close.
That's a really interesting way of comparison, because I don't think we can say that there is like a distinctively American or British or Japanese or German way of putting songs together when it comes to metal. Like when it comes to folk music or stuff like that, yeah, definitely. But heavy metal is something that kind of bridged all these different countries and cultures. And I mean, maybe that's part of the lure of metal, is it tied you in with a international community, you know?
That's a great point. Yeah, I think well, even, you know, from bands like Loudness to you know, we identified with it because it was, as metalheads, we accepted that as heavy metal and something that we could escape into, something we could identify with.
Yeah.
You know, as we've said in, you know, as we've always said, you know, I think a true metalhead is a special type of person. And, you know, you can't really fool a metalhead, a true metalhead. It's kind of like earlier when we were talking about trying to sneak into the metal scene when you're not really a metal band and not really making it, because we'd have to buy it. You know, it's not like sneaking into pop. So like Kiss FM pop stations, that could be a lot different.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting to think going the other way about the bands that were successfully able to cross over to much larger audiences. I mean, I think if you liked Triumph, you probably also liked Dokken, and you probably also liked Heart, and, you know, other stuff in that I think about people I knew who were like into all that stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And you wouldn't see too many like really dark, troubled metalheads who had a Triumph patch or anything like that, because, you know, they're not going to, if they were going to fight the good fight, it'd be like, you know, yeah, let's, you know, break into houses and kill the cops or something like that. Right. So, yeah. So Andrew says, for my part, I found Canadian structure as verse, chorus, verse, US verse, chorus, bridge, solo, outro. Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, what that would mean is that Canadian stuff would be simpler in structure, you know? I don't see that.
The bridge in a lot of the metal stuff either happened before the solo or after the solo.
Yeah.
And it depended on the tune, and bands would mix that up. You know, like the bridge would bring you a new place, and then, you know, the explosions into the solo, and sometimes the key change into the last chorus. I don't, you know, I don't, I'm trying to think just off the top of my head if the structures were, I don't know if the structures were different because of where they were written. It could have been a personal thing, but they were all about the same.
Yeah.
Until some of the bands went more proggy, that's a whole different ball of wax.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of these other bands. So Razor, another great speed metal, arguably thrash band.
Yeah.
Executioner's Song comes out in '85. It's just like album after album after album for them. Another one in '85, Evil Invaders. And I think that's tough to do, to have like 2 albums in the same year, especially when you're touring.
Yes.
Another one that I think a lot of people might want to get into is Witchkiller. And you can find it on YouTube. They only managed to put out 1 EP called Day of the Saxons, but it's pretty fun stuff. And there's definitely like a new wave of British heavy metal influence there. Piledriver has come up before. They were actually not a real band as such. They were a studio project, that aimed at making the heaviest album they could create. And the result of that was Metal Inquisition, which is pretty good. They had another follow-up, Stay Ugly, 2 years later. And so here's at least digging around. Here's part of the backstory. So Piledriver was created by a suggestion. This guy that was being interviewed, he referred to this other guy's Record Weasel, and he suggested that if they made a metal album with a crazy cover and songs to match, they could easily expect to sell 20,000 copies. And so it was a money grab essentially, but it was a money grab that turned out good. So kind of a cool thing, but they didn't tour or anything.
The Steely Dan of metal.
Yeah, there you go. Sacrifice. Now we're getting more into thrash stuff. They're a Canadian thrash band. They have some albums in the mid 80s, late 80s. Dead Brain Cells, another thrash band. And now we're getting towards the end of the 80s when, metal is you might say playing itself out, spilling off into other genres. Aggression starts out originally as Asylum and changes their name eventually in 85, and then 87 they put out an album. And then we've got Annihilator, who I think it was maybe Andrew brought up before, or it was Ken. A lot of turnover in that band. Jeff Waters is the only consistent member, and he has done lots and lots of stuff with it. It's sort of like an Algie Ward type of character in ways. You think about Tank. They don't put out an album until late 80s. And then, we get some other stuff, interesting stuff going on with, black metal beginning in Vancouver in particular. And there's this band Blasphemy that are definitely living up to the black metal lifestyle. They all wind up in jail at one time or another, engaging in crimes. It kind of sets them back a bit in terms of getting things done. They don't actually manage to bring out a demo until 1989. Then, we've got some prog metal bands as well. Varga, I gave them a listen. They're interesting. But they don't manage to put out any albums until the 90s. They start touring and all that. But we do have Voivod. And Voivod is, how to describe them? Their own weird, they're not a genre because they don't stick to a genre, but they're definitely doing their own weird thing. So like one Voivod album is not going to sound like another Voivod album. They're the opposite of AC/DC in that respect, right? Where the old joke goes that somebody's criticizing AC/DC for making 13 albums that all sound the same. And he's like, that's where you're wrong, mate. We've got 14.
Yeah, right. The stuff that I looked at them, I watched a live concert, and it was thrashy. It was speed. It was kind of speed metal. Like I would say, if that was one of the eras, I named them as a thrash.
That was the early era, yeah.
Yeah, and I thought it was pretty good.
I heard about them and heard them back in the mid to late 80s. But it was from the kind of guys who, again, sort of a stereotype. They live in the basement. They got the stereo with all the cool equalizer knobs. So when you you dim the lights, you can just see that. The kind of guys who are telling you about all the other weird thrash bands that went beyond hearing about Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, that sort of stuff. They're like, you got to hear this, man. Right. So those are the kind of people that I knew that were into Voivod. I don't remember what I thought of them when I heard them that well.
I didn't know them until looking them up on that one live show.
Okay.
And I was surprised because it was one of the more I'll use the word thrashier bands on the list.
Yeah. I think the last thing before because Scott's got a hard time stop and I've got some other things I got to get to, but I think, we've talked about this a lot in the past. The late 80s moving into the early 90s, it isn't that like grunge came out and just killed metal or anything like that. I mean, it did have a big impact on the hair metal scene, as they call it, which I think we can think about as like things from traditional into glam metal, right?
Yeah.
Even the traditional bands suffered, like Iron Maiden. Record sales went down, but they still were able to tour.
Yeah.
I don't think that had as big of an impact on Canadian metal bands, in part because they weren't making as much money as American bands were. So there wasn't as much to lose. And they had a more extensive, deeper roots kind of automatic fan base than some of the. So think of it like in gardening metaphors, right? You have some beautiful things that you buy at the gardening shop, but they don't have deep roots. As soon as the hard times come, lots of sun, no rain, those die. But you got the kind of weeds and stuff like that you grew on your own. They're going to do just fine. So I think we see similar things too in the Nordic scene. They flourish in the 90s, even more than they did in the 80s, but they're not as deeply tied into like what happens to make its way onto MTV. So yeah. Oh, Ken has something interesting. In a way, Voivod may have been a sign of things to come. Canada currently has a thriving technical death metal scene. Not my thing, but I'm told there's lots of it and it's very professional. Yeah, I mean, I think the same things happened with the proliferations of genres. There's death metal, black metal, doom metal scenes all over the place that are doing quite well.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, speaking of the deep roots comment, I mean, I think that's why bands like Iron Maiden survived.
Yeah.
Because them and Priest had such a when they got popular, that they had a real hardcore fan base. It wasn't a gimmick that was keeping them on the radio for a couple of years. I mean, I'm not putting anyone down. I'm just saying there's a difference between some of the bands that kind of ended up falling to the wayside with grunge.
Yeah.
And then,
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, even seeing Ozfest, I don't know if it was 15, 20 years ago, I don't know, but seeing, Priest light the place on fire just because they were so great, and, seeing 20,000 people, that was pretty satisfying,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you can say, like, if you're into Anvil, you're into Anvil.
You're right.
You're going to show up at the shows. You're going to be interested in what happens to the band, or some of these other bands like Sword, or, because some have broken up, gotten back together as a lot of American and British bands have done, to go to the festivals and cash in. And that's great. It's wonderful that we have the opportunity to see some of these bands live.
Sure.
On that note, there've been a few reunions of Triumph, over the years. That would be kind of a fun band to see live. I don't think I've seen any of these bands that we've talked about live.
I haven't. You haven't seen Rush?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I saw them a lot. I never saw Triumph, but okay. Rick Emmett is doing appearances even now, where he's doing some of the old stuff. I don't know the status of them, if they had a falling out, or they're just not getting back together, or somebody retired, or
that's the thing too. So somber note to kind of bring this to a close. With a lot of these things that happened in the 70s and 80s, Yeah, we really need to get to enjoy them while we can, because quite a few of these people are either they're dying, or they're getting so old that they can't do what they used to do. Even D Snyder, years ago, when Twisted Sister stopped doing their shows, he was like, it's not fair to the audience to tour as Twisted Sister if I can't jump off of
Right.
risers onto the stage. I'll tour by myself. And now when he's touring, I saw this on Twitter, he was saying, I do sets of 4 to 6 songs because that's what I can do well. I'm not going to like promise people that I'll do a 12 song set and then crap out by the 8th song.
Right.
I think I need to deliver this, which I think is very prudent.
Yes. Yeah. Some other people should have seen that.
So here's a good one from Andrew. Would Anvil's story carry the same appeal if not for the 2008 documentary? Did myth making save their legacy more than their music?
Ooh.
I'll let you. I've only got like a little bit to say about that, but I'm curious to see what you have to say about that, Scott.
I was under the impression that the documentary wasn't very flattering.
Yeah, it's not Spinal Tap level of skewering people, but
right. I mean, I think,
but it could be unflattering and also like have ethos to it, right? You're like, wow, look at these guys. They, things go to crap for them, and they just keep, plowing through. And you could be like, man, I sure wouldn't do that. But
what it did do is it brought the name to a lot of people that never heard of them.
Yeah.
So that can't hurt. Even if it was a bum me out story, I think a lot of people got curious. Who are these people? Because there was a lot of promotion for the documentary.
Yeah,
and I've never heard of these people. Who are they? And then you go check them out. So I'm sure it was helpful in some ways. Yeah, I don't know if they'd have I think they had some hardcore fans early on.
Yeah.
But I think the story did help. I think that's a good point.
I kind of think because they're a good band with some great songs.
Yeah.
And a consistent catalog. So it's not like they had one great record and then crapped out after that, they weren't a one-hit wonder. I think the documentary definitely helped to, like you said, Scott, draw attention from people who either didn't know about them or had forgotten about them.
That's a good point.
But I think if the music wasn't there to actually support it, it wouldn't have been very helpful. It would have been kind of a flash in the pan. So it was great for drawing attention back to them, and really deserved attention.
Yeah,
because they had such shitty luck. I mean, so many bands had such shitty luck dealing with their record companies, and they missed their great opportunity. I think, would they be as successful now if the documentary hadn't come out? No, definitely not. But it's not like the documentary remade them or anything.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I mean, the myth making thing is kind of an interesting idea, because if we looked at heavy metal bands in a very unvarnished way, a lot of the stuff they do is pretty boring, sitting on tour buses, tuning their instruments,
right,
hours of practice, right?
Yeah,
designing logos. But I think the myth making thing is pretty important.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know you got to go, Scott. So because you got a gig coming up, right?
I got to head out. Make my way up north.
Yeah. So thanks to everybody for coming, and the great questions and comments. And we got some other cool stuff coming down the line. We've talked about some of the things we want to get to eventually. So, all right. You want to take us out with the last word, Scott?
Sure. It was great to realized some of these bands were actually Canadian bands, and I discovered some bands I hadn't heard of that I thought were pretty good. So it's definitely an interesting topic. I don't know of a topic like this one that existing, so I thought it was a very clever thing to discuss. So I had a great time.